All right, can everyone go to this link and download this image? We'll be using it in our app for the background. All right, and then to get started, go ahead and open Xcode. So if it's not showing you the correct thing, go to File, click New, and go to Project. And click New Project, my bad. Or if you're on the main screen of Xcode, just say Create a New Project. So once you're here, go ahead and select Single View Application. That's what we'll be using today. We won't be using any of the other options right now. And then we'll go ahead and name it. So I'm going to name mine Hello API Live. Next. All right. And before we get started, let's go ahead and try running the app as it's empty. And if you're having any issues or have any questions, go ahead and raise your hand. Ryuji and Yusuf over here will come and help you. So I'm going to run it. And right now, if you run it, you should just get a blank app. So right now, we've just actually ran our first app. All right. So I'm going to do a quick run through of the different parts of Xcode. So for those of you that don't know what Xcode is the IDE used for iOS development. Regardless of where you are, what company you work for, in the end, you will be using this tool. Apple uses it, Facebook uses it, Google uses it. Every single company under the sun that makes an iOS application uses Xcode. What Xcode does is allow you to create iOS applications. Even if you create a web-based app, you end up having to use Xcode to compile and then deploy it to the App Store. So the benefits of using Xcode are that it's super powerful and very easy to start actually creating applications. This new project that we've started, if you haven't already, if you don't have the sidebars open at the top right, you'll notice that there's these three buttons that you can click. So click that to expand the left sidebar. And if this folder isn't expanded, expand each thing. So we'll expand that. We'll expand that. So within the folder that says Hello API Live, can everyone see this okay? Can you guys see it on your laptop? Just expand this because there's no way to zoom in right there. Can everyone read this code okay? Yes, no, maybe so? Can I get a thumbs up if you can read the code on the screen? Okay, good. All right, so I'm going to run through the different files that are automatically generated for you. So the first file is the app delegate. The app delegate dictates, runs at different times of the life cycle of your application. If you notice, the first function is actually called application did finish launching with options. This function is run whenever your application starts. So literally what this means is this section of code will run when your application starts. Inside of this, you can do things like check if a user is already logged in, check if a resource is available, like if it's connected to the internet, stuff like that. You can do that all within here. There's also other functions like application will resign active. That means the app is now active and it's leaving the active mode. There's entering the background, which literally means when your app goes into the background, you close it and go to the main screen. Application will enter foreground. When your app comes back to the foreground, right, the app is now opened again. There's application did become active and will terminate. I think you guys can infer what those do. The next thing that I'm going to go over, we're going to skip view controller for now. We're going to go to main storyboard. So main storyboard is actually where you'll lay out the UI for your application. By default, main storyboard is the one that's generated. You can have multiple storyboards that connect to multiple parts of your app. But usually if it's a smaller app like this, you tend to just keep one storyboard. And we'll be laying out all our UI elements on here. The next thing is the assets.xc assets. This is where we'll import any resources that we'll be using, like images and app icons and etc. The next thing is the launch screen storyboard. This launch screen storyboard is literally what it means. When your app starts, if you guys notice, there's always a split second where there's like an image or like people usually put the logo of their company on. You see that and then the application starts. This is where that's made, the launch screen storyboard. The last thing is the info.plist, which stands for property list. So inside here is where you define properties for your applications. We probably won't have to use this unless we have an issue with networking, but this is where you define things like, hey, I'm using the network for this reason, or you can define a property that says we'll be using the camera for this reason. This is where you'll be doing all that. Right now, you guys don't really need to know too much about this, but just something to keep in mind for the future if you ever want to make something really complicated. And then the last thing is the products folder. The products folder is literally where like your app has now compiled and it's built into a product, right? You will probably never have to touch this, so don't worry too much about this. But if you want to get into it, there's stuff you can do with that. And then let's go back. I said we're going to skip the view controller, but now let's go back to the view controller. If you remember when we looked at the storyboard, there was only a single screen, right? And remember, right now my phone looks like this because as you can see in here, there's just a single blank screen. This blank screen, even though if you lay out UI elements, show question?
Oh yeah, I may have misclicked something, but where you have app
delegate.h. Oh, you're using Objective-C. So make a new project. When you're naming it at the bottom, there's different. There's a section that lets you click which programming language you want to use. Okay. Click Swift instead of Objective-C. Yeah, Objective-C is a whole nother beast right now. Okay, but back to this. We have this blank screen. Even though we lay out UI elements, if we lay out things onto the screen, we display things cool. It'll look fine, but it won't actually do anything. To actually do the coding and define the logic, we use what are called view controllers. So if I click here, you'll notice that this is actually connected to the file called view controller, the class called view controller. So let's go to that class. You'll notice it's pretty simple. This is called a view controller. Within here is where you define the logic for your application at whatever point in time it's at. So this view controller file will define that first screen that we've opened up on our app right now, right? So to get started, just to kind of help you visualize what's happening right now, go into the view did load, make a new line, and type in print hello world. And go ahead and run your app. So I'm not going to show you what's on the app because as you guys know right now, it's just a blank screen. But you will notice that when my app opens, the first thing that's printed out right here, if you guys can read that, it's pretty small, it says hello world. So right here is showing you that when the app opens and goes to this first screen, the first code that's executed as of right now is that section where hello world is inside. So now we can actually go back. We're going to start by designing the UI first, and then we'll be adding in the code. So right now, if you remember, I told you guys to all download that background image. Can anybody tell me where they think we might put that background image? Where we might import it to, at least. If that's a better question, go ahead. Exactly. So everyone open up assets.exe assets. Right click here and click import. And then navigate to wherever you downloaded the image to. So I downloaded it to my desktop. I'm going to go ahead and open that up. So you notice it's a pretty basic image. I just made this like yesterday over like 5 minutes. It's supposed to be a Pokédex. But you'll notice now it's imported into our project. We can use this when we're designing the UI. So let's go back to the storyboard and let's get started right into designing our UI. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is actually create the background. So if you don't have the, by the way, if you don't have the right sidebar open, make sure that's open. There you go. You'll notice at the bottom right, there's a place where you can select different things. So here is where you can actually drag in pre-created views. In iOS, views are UI elements that you can use to display things. So let's start off by actually dragging in the image we just imported. So if you open up what's called the media library, you'll notice that the image that we already used called Pokédex is already there. We can go ahead and just drag it right into our application. You might notice it's slightly big. Oh, okay, so let's resize that. To resize an image in Xcode, go ahead and click on it. As long as your sidebar is open, you can see right here there's a ruler. Click the ruler and you'll have a width and a height. Let's go ahead and decrease that very heavily. Oh my. All right, and now if it's small enough, you'll be able to just drag it like this and resize it correctly. One thing you'll notice that this image has it's kind of distorted as far as like it's zoomed in. The reason is when you're working with images, there's different ways you can view the content of it, which is the image. So go to the thing that looks like a pencil. It's called the attributes inspector. Go to content mode and put aspect fit. If you do aspect fit, it'll fit and it'll look like this. Is anybody having any issues doing this right now? All good. Yusuf? Yusuf? What's up? Here. Easy. Oh, here. Now you can. Oh, I think. Yeah, you can just. I think you have. Did you? Go to. It's just way too big. Click on the image, right? And then click on the ruler at the top right. No, you're right. Click on the ruler. See that ruler? No, the top right. Just change the width to like 500. It'll make it more manageable. Sorry, my bad. I made it way too big. Yeah, press it. Not drag. There you go. But yeah, just play around with that. Now you can reset. Yeah. Oh, go to that. And then you can drag it. So fine. You guys. Just go to the ruler and change it. Wait. Anybody else?
What is the aspect?
It's just because the image is so huge. Like it's way bigger than the actual website. Go to the ruler at the top right, and I'll give you a width and height. All right, guys. It seems like I made the image way too big. Make sure you're going to the ruler up here, and then type these in specifically. For the x value, put 0. For the y value, put 0. For the width, put 375. And for the height, put 667 seems to do it. So remember, you can edit the image's width and position and everything by clicking on the image and clicking the ruler at the top right of Xcode. Okay. All right, so if you remember, our application is going to end up looking like this. So what we need to do is drag out UI elements that let us display text as well as the image right in the middle. So the easiest way to do this is at the bottom right, if you see the circle with the little square in it, go ahead and click that. These are the list of our pre-made views that you can use within your app. We're going to be using what's called a UI label. So a UI label allows you to display a single line or multiple lines of text. This is used when you want to display things like a name, information about something, a description, and so on. So let's go ahead and, by the way, guys, I'm doing this by typing in UI label right there. I don't know if you guys can see that at the bottom right. After selecting the circle with the square in it. UI label, and then you can just drag them out onto the actual UI. So let's start off by copying exactly how. All right. There we go. Let's copy exactly how I have it laid out right here. So how I made it, what I started with is, let's forget about the buttons for now, but what I started with is there's an ID. So there's an ID that holds the number of the Pokemon in the Pokédex. So let's go ahead and call this label ID. We'll just type in ID as a placeholder text. We'll just align it right there. And for those of you that are familiar with like regular text editing programs and such, Xcode is really cool in the fact that it lets you edit the properties of these UI elements really easily. So if you click the attributes inspector, which is the thing that looks like a little pencil, you can actually edit all the properties of this UI label. So let's start off by making the color of it white, because right now it's pretty hard to see. So you can change it in many different ways. One way is to open up this wheel. The wheel, and then you can select white by just going to the middle or just changing the slider all the way to the left. And then let's make it white. So that'll give us our ID. The next thing that we're going to want is we're going to want a name. So a cool shortcut that you can do, instead of going back here and dragging out another, you can click on this, then hold Alt, click on it again and drag, and it'll make a duplicate of it. Well, there you go. And then let's go ahead and type in name here. Let's align it to the middle. And also I'm going to make this one bold just so we have a bit of a difference between the previous one. And then you'll notice that because name, the text actually is more than how big the size of this box is, the easiest way to resize it is to press Command equals. So now we got the ID, the name, and the next thing that we're going to want to do is the type. So let's go ahead and press Alt and copy from here. I'm going to align it to the left. I'm going to call it type. You'll notice the next thing is a description. It shelters itself in a shell, then strikes back. Let's do Charmander just because. So we'll go ahead and tag that right here. We'll type in this is a description. So the reason that I'm actually typing things into these UI elements, even though we haven't actually loaded things, it's easier to recognize what it is when you're editing the UI. So this is a really good way to make placeholders, and it's good practice as far as iOS development goes. Because when someone looks at your storyboard later on, they won't know what random labels do if it just says label everywhere. But this way they know what it does. So there you go. This is a description. The next thing that we want is we want a label for attack, a label for defense, special attack, special defense, height, and weight. So we're going to make one label for each of the names. So that ends up with 6 labels. And if we type in attack, defense, special, attack, special defense. What do we have? Height, and weight. All right, and now the next thing that we want to do is these labels, just describe them. If you noticed in the actual completed app, we have another label that holds the actual values. So just drag these and make another set of labels on the right of each one. So I'm just going to put random values. I'm going to put 50 here, 50 here, 50 here, 50 here, and 50 here, and there. Does anybody have any major issues that they want to address, or everyone following along pretty good? Are we going too fast, too slow? Just about good? Okay. Just making sure. Don't want to lose everyone. All right. So let's just line them up. Right now, it's not too important. We'll talk about aligning things and what auto layout is later on if we have time. But just align it just so it's just about correct. You'll also get these awesome guidelines in Xcode. If you have a force touch trackpad, you'll also notice that the trackpad will vibrate, indicating that you've hit these boundaries. So I'm going to go ahead and run it on my phone. And ta-da! So far we've gotten this background set up. We've gotten placeholder labels. Right now these labels don't actually hold anything. So it's a pretty basic app. But as you can see, our app is already coming along pretty well. We've already have something that you can show off. The next thing that we want to do, though, is we actually want to load information from the network. So what we'll do is, I'll leave this here. All right. This sidebar. You'll notice at the top right of Xcode, there's a little button that looks like a Venn diagram. If you click it, this is what's called the Assistant Editor. The Assistant Editor is pretty cool because what it allows you to do is it can automatically open up related files based on what's on the left editor. So right now we're on the storyboard and I've selected this scene. It automatically opens up the view controller that's related to it. And as a recap, the view controller is what controls the logic within this scene. So even though we have this code and we can start writing the logic, the code doesn't know these UI elements exist. So in iOS, there's something called outlets. So instead of explaining what it is, I'm going to show you how to create an outlet. First you click on whatever you want. You hold Control, click on it, and then drag it into your code up here. For those of you that have already had exposure to programming, you might know what global variables are or instance variables. In a sense, we're connecting it as a global/instance variable. So let's call this an ID label. And you'll notice now we have a reference to this element within our code. And if I go to this little circle right here, it'll highlight what it's actually connected to. So with this reference, we can actually manipulate it, right? So we can now change the text within it, do different things. So to test this out, within that, remember how I said this runs first, where we have print hello world right now? Let's go ahead and type in id label.text. And let's set its text to, let's say, the letter A, just to show you how we can change it within the code. So remember that we manually created it. We set the text inside of it to ID, right? But now when I run it, the text inside of it is the letter A. Because now we've actually taken the step further and we've started actually using code to manipulate our objects. We've made a reference to it, and now we're manipulating it by doing this. So now we have the letter A in it. It's really basic. It might sound really stupid, but it's a big first step as far as like getting stuff working. All right, so we've connected the ID label, but we have a bunch of other labels that we want to connect. So for each one of these, go ahead and connect them. So let's connect the name label. And In Swift programming, the best naming convention as far as doing this is having the name in lowercase, and then every other word inside the name, the first letter is capital. This is called camel casing. So what I usually use is, like, for this, I say name and then capital L label. Let me make this. Is everyone able to connect the code to the view controller correctly? All right, so make sure you're holding control. You click you click and you drag from there. Is that working? And make sure you're not dragging it into the function. Make sure you're dragging it above in this area between the class declaration and the function declaration for view did load. Anybody having any issues with this? What's up? Is it just not working? Here, see this part? See how there's a little yellow circle up here? Click that yellow circle. Then here, click here. See, click right here. Click automatic. Now try dragging and see if that works. Is it working? Is it just not showing the line or anything? You see if you want to help out? Right there in the green shirt. All right, but anyways, continue connecting each of the labels. So I'm gonna call this description label. And we don't need to actually edit any of these labels that just describe it. So only edit the ones that currently have numbers in them, because those are the ones that will actually hold the values. So I'm going to call this attack label. We'll call this defense label. I'm going to call this SP attack label. SP defense label. Height label and weight label. All right, so let's go ahead and get rid of our sample test code. So right now we should just have clean code right now. Our code should look like this. There you go. I copied my whole view controller into the Google Docs if you guys want to see how it should look. Don't copy and paste that into yours because that'll mess things up, but just make sure yours looks similar. What's that? Okay, so miscreating labels is a very common way to actually, it'll crash your app if you don't delete it correctly. So what you can do is just delete the line of code, then go to your label and right click or control click on it like this. And it'll give you this little black box, and you'll notice there's little connections here, right? Make sure you click X on that, because the reason is we made this connection to the code, but when you delete it from the code, in the background, Xcode has actually done even more to connect it from the storyboard to that. So if you delete it from the code and just try to connect it again, it'll give you this huge error. But make sure you delete the code, then go right click on it, and then clear that connection by clicking X. It's not too hard, but usually people run into this error. All right, let's give it a minute so everyone can connect all the labels. Yeah, what's up? Oh, okay. The reason you made a, did you make a connection that ID? Okay. So the reason is you're asking that this ID. So what you need to do whenever you practice, let's say there's two, right? Now, I think everyone's all good. All right, so now we're actually going to go straight into accessing the network. So we're actually going to make the API request to get the information. What we'll do is we'll separate the code from the actual view did load code. So down here, we'll create a new function. So is everyone familiar with a function? Pretty much? Yeah? Can I get a show of hands? Don't feel bad if you don't know what a function is. I mean, it took me a while. Okay, so I'll do a quick rundown of what a function is. In programming, a function allows you to put a list of code in that can be executed by calling this function. So if I tell you to run this, like a function, like let's say view did load, it'll execute every single line of code within that function. I hope that makes sense for most of you that are new to programming and new to functions. So what we're going to do is we're going to create one of these functions down here. We're going to call it function, we're going to call this load from API. Right now, we're not going to pass anything to it, but we're going to go ahead and make a function. So this is how you write a function in Swift for those of you that aren't familiar. It's just func, the name, parentheses, and then braces. This is really familiar. This is pretty familiar to Java for those of you like in 180 or maybe even C for those of you in 240. You know, so this would be considered a void. Yeah, we're not returning anything, so. All right, so right now, for those of you that might be wondering, we're also not passing any parameters right now. If we have time, we'll start passing a parameter for the ID of the Pokemon, so then we can go through every single Pokemon. But right now, we're just working with Charmander, like we said in the beginning. All right, so the first thing that we're going to want to do is I've created an endpoint for all of you to use today. So this endpoint is called HerokuApp.Pokemon. It's helloapi.herokuapp.com/Pokemon. If I access it normally, you'll notice it says you need to choose a Pokemon. So what I've done for this API is I've actually made it require a single parameter when you're coding. So what I'll do is down here, what we'll do is the parameter that we're going to use is, sorry. There we go. Okay, the parameter that we're going to use is called ID. I created it so that you can pass in an ID of a Pokemon and it'll return that information. Like we said before, the ID of Charmander is 4. So our API call will be to this address. So this is really weird, but okay. So I went ahead and made a call to it with the parameter 4. And you notice that now it's returned to me all the information about Charmander. It's returned its name, special attack, height, ID, an image even, and all that fun stuff. So now let's go ahead and implement this within our code. So to do that, Whenever we have a URL, which this was, the endpoint is a URL, right? It's just a web address to go to like a website, except it just has extra information. We had to create a URL object. So what you need to do in Swift, there's something called guard statements. So we're going to type in guard let URL. So this might be kind of confusing, but bear along with me. Just copy this for now. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to type in the endpoint that we're using. Hello API.Heroku app. ID. And then if you remember, since Charmander's ID is 4, we're going to make this URL with, we're going to hard code it in that the ID is 4. And there, and then type in else, and then what we're going to do is just return. So you might be wondering, why do we have this really weird statement that starts with the word guard? So in Swift, there's a data type called optionals. For those of you that are not familiar with this, not many other languages use something like this, but optionals allow you to use any kind of data type and assign it a value that, okay, so it indicates the absence of a value or a value thereof. So pretend you have an integer. For those of you that aren't familiar with an integer is a number, right? So it could be 1, 2, 3, 4. So we have this variable that holds an integer. If you make it an optional, it'll tell you whether or not it holds an integer. For those of you that are familiar with Java, whenever you create an integer, it'll default the value or create a random value, right? But in Swift, if you create an optional integer, it can have the value of nil, which indicates that, hey, there's no value in here at all. So the reason we use this statement is whenever you have a URL, if you type in something incorrectly, it becomes an invalid URL, right? There doesn't exist anything that it accesses. So when we instantiate a URL object in Swift, it does a quick check to make sure that your syntax is correct, you've typed in the URL correctly, and to ensure that you're not going to some random like weird string. So guardlet says, let's start from let. Let URL says, create a URL object and store it in a variable called URL. Guard just says, hey, if that URL is invalid, we say else, just return. So what this is saying is, if this URL was invalid for some weird reason, we typed it wrong, it would return and it would stop your app from crashing. This is more of a type safety thing. It's just good coding practice to make sure you do this. Do not worry about the syntax at all. I really don't want any of you guys to try to memorize any of the syntax. Just try to understand the idea behind what's happening right now. So what's happening right now is we're just checking to make sure the URL is correct. So let's go ahead and continue. The next thing that we need to do is, now that we have a URL, we actually need to connect to the internet. Oh, did we get? Oh boy. Is it time? Oh shit. All right, you're gonna give it a second, guys. Sorry. The school restarts all the projectors at a certain time every day, and it's. I'm not lying. This is an actual thing. They restart all the audio video systems on a schedule, and it seems like we just got screwed for a second. Oh, I got one. All right, we're back. Okay. That was good. All right, so the next thing is, now that we have a URL, we want to take this URL and tell our app, hey, I want to make a connection to the internet to this specific URL. So we're going to create what's called a URL session. So we're going to create a variable by typing let session equals URL session. And within it, we're actually going to create it. So for those of you that aren't familiar with constructors, there's these objects within programming. And whenever you create an object, it asks for data to create itself. So let's say we have a car object. It'll ask for its type, its color, stuff like that. this URL session object that we're creating is asking us for a configuration. Luckily, we don't know how to create this configuration because hard-coded within Swift, well, within Swift is actually a configuration. So all you had to do is type in .default. Don't worry about what it does. What this statement is doing is saying, let's create a variable that holds something that's going to let us connect to the internet. So that's what let session equals URL session configuration default does. Does anybody have any specific questions about the syntax or anything about Swift so far? I know I've kind of just like ran into it. Go ahead. This one? All right, so what this is doing, we're instantiating an object called URL session. For those of you that aren't familiar with objects, just assume that we're creating something from a blueprint. So URL session is our blueprint. We're creating this object that's going to let us connect to the internet. So that's pretty much it. Session is just a literal session to the internet. And when we use it, it's just a connection to the internet. Go ahead.
How do you distinguish separate lines without semicolons?
Xcode is pretty cool. When you enter, it automatically does that. Yeah, so the thing about Swift is there's no semicolons at all. The best way to do that is when you run your app, it'll throw all kinds of errors if you screw up. Like, there's like almost no error tolerance at all. So chances are you won't run into that issue, but what I do is I make sure that my coding syntax is correct. I always make sure to indent every single line correctly, because there's a lot of people that they go to the next line and they keep it the same. So like this return statement will be here, and then their code ends up being really ugly. Having good coding practice helps you avert that. Like there's no need for semicolons at that point. Because like I don't know if you've used Python before. Python is all indentation based. It's even worse than this. So yeah. Don't feel bad about that. It's kind of nice that you don't have semicolons. Some people love semicolons, so if that's your thing, that's your thing. But yeah, I enjoy this because it saves me an extra key press. But yeah, any other questions about syntax or any topics or anything I might have blazed over? Or everyone understanding relatively well enough? Okay, so yeah, that's a good question. So in this statement, that is the if statement, if that makes sense. It's instantiating the object, but if the instantiation fails because that URL is invalid, that automatically goes to the else statement. Because you know how normally you have like an if and then an else statement? This is an else statement first. You get rid of the error condition, and then you continue with your code. It's kind of weird. It takes some time getting used to, but yeah. All right, let's continue. So the next thing that we're going to want to do is, now that we've created this session, we actually want to define what this session is going to do. So go ahead and type in session.dataTask. So we're saying this session will make a task where it's going to reach out to a server and get data back for us. So you'll notice that the autocomplete has all kinds of data tasks that we're going to use. The one that you actually want to use right now is data task with URL. Don't worry about the other ones for now. The one we're using is this. So in here, while it's still highlighted, don't click out of it. Type in URL. So we're using that object. We're using that object we created earlier. Press tab and it'll highlight this section. If you press enter, it expands it out. So what this is I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with a closure. Anybody know what a closure is? Okay, you're all good. I had no idea what it was either. So this little bracket contained code is saying that whenever this data task is run, what it does is it'll run the code inside of it. So let's continue typing out code. It'll make more sense in a little. So we're going to call this first thing data, this one response, and this one error. So inside these brackets that have just been created, we're going to type if let error equals error. We're just going to return. We're just going to return for now. To explain what's happening is when this session is run, this data task is run, it gets three things as a response from the server. It gets the data, so if it's successful, it'll get the data, say the JSON that I was talking about earlier. The second is the response. Response is just going to be a big bunch of text that describes how the response worked, whether or not it was successful, error code, well, not error codes necessarily, but things that the server, information that the server has returned. The last thing is an error. Error is literally an object that has been created because of this session thing, and that'll tell you if there is an error, that something has gone wrong, and you can print out the issues of the error. For now, what we're doing here is we're taking error and we're opening it up. If that so error is an optional object. So if there is no error, error will be equal to nil, which means there's nothing there, right? So if there's nothing there, it doesn't matter. We want to continue with our code. Everything's fine. The server hasn't said anything bad. But if there is an error, we're still not sure if it's nil or not because it's an optional. So what this statement here, the if let error equals error, it opens it up. Think of it as if it's a present. So whenever you open a present, you don't necessarily know if there's something in it or not until you open it. So what this statement does is it opens it up, ensures that there's an error within it, and if there is, we return. So we break out and we stop at that point. So we finished that. So we've gotten rid of the case where there is an error. Now we can continue with our code where, hey, we're gonna take that data we've just got and put it into our actual UI. So the next step is, all right, there we go. If you remember, our data is returned to us as JSON, but right now the code doesn't necessarily know it's JSON. So what we had to do is parse this information. So we're going to use inbuilt parsing that's in Swift. So let's create an object called JSON. Let me put it lowercase so I don't confuse people. And then we're going to use try JSON serialization, JSON object with data. And our options will be this empty array. All right, so this statement, actually, and also let me copy this over to our Google. All right, I've copied the code we have so far into here. All right, so how many of you are familiar with try-catch statements in Java? Or any language, really. Okay, so what this statement is doing in Swift is we're forcing a try right now. Just for the case of this workshop, this is actually kind of bad coding practice, but just for the case of this workshop, since we've already said if there's an error, return, it would never get here. So now we're saying we know that there's no error, so we're assuming that there is data. We've gotten this JSON, and it's running this statement. What this statement does is it runs this inbuilt function that allows you to parse data returned to you from the server. So the data is JSON. So now what Swift has done is said, hey, this is JSON. I'm going to store it in this special JSON object. And then we're storing it in a variable called JSON. Normally, you could do a try-catch statement if you really wanted to do, but just for the purposes, by doing try exclamation mark, you can force it to run regardless. But if there is an error, it would crash the complete app. But, so let's continue. Does anybody have any questions about that statement? All good? So what try does is it says execute the statement regardless if there is an error, but if there is an error, your app will just crash. Normally, you'd have try, and underneath, and there'll be brackets, and then your code would be in there. And then, well, actually in Swift it would be do, but never mind. We'll just say try. And then there'd be a catch statement. Inside that, there would be a block where it says, if an error occurs, do this set of code instead. So what we're doing is we're forcing code to run because we've assumed that there is data. Don't worry too much about this. This is not important as far as the grand scheme of things, but it's just something to think about. Any other questions? All right. So the next thing is, now that we have this JSON object, we want to store it into something more readable. So we're going to cast it to something called a dictionary. How many of you are familiar with dictionaries or hash maps? All right, we got a few. So in programming, how many of you are familiar with a regular dictionary? Am I getting old or we're off? Okay, that's good. Okay, so in a regular dictionary, if you look up a word, related to that word will be a definition, right? So if I give you the word apple, it'll tell you a red round fruit. So in programming, there's something called dictionaries. It's literally the same as that concept. Given something, it returns you something else. But it gets a bit more complex where you can give it a number and it returns you like a string, which could be like a description. Or in our case, JSON works, the JSON that we're using is a string returns you something. It doesn't necessarily have to be a number, doesn't necessarily have to be a string, it could be anything. We have a type in Swift for that. It's actually called any. So let's create this variable. It's called pokeinfo, is the previous variable we called. Some of you might be familiar with casting. Casting is forcing an object to become another object. To do that in Swift, you type in the variable name as exclamation mark, and then we're going to type in dictionary. Sorry, losing my voice. When you define a dictionary is what's called a generic object. Generic objects are objects that can assume any type. So, like I said before, integers store numbers. Another data type is strings. Strings store things like sentences. So we're going to cast this to be a string that relates to every element in it is a string that relates to anything. All right, so we got a string that relates to anything. So now, before we actually continue, oh, what did I break? Oh yeah, I forgot the equal sign. My bad, people. All right, so let's go ahead and print out. Let's print it out and make sure that our app is running correctly, and actually get the server started. All right, let's go ahead and run this. So if our code works as expected, right, we should get it to print out information right in that console. What do we got? Oh, actually, never mind. We're good. Okay, actually, one thing that I forgot to say. So remember how we created this function, right? Does anybody know what you had to do to functions to get them to run? You gotta call them. And guess what I didn't do? All right, so everyone go back to the view did load. So remember that we created this code that's to run whenever load from API is called. We say, hey, run load from API. It runs all that code inside of it. But the code that's already there hasn't told it to run already. So just go into view did load and type load from API. It should autocomplete and just be like that. And now we can run it and figure out if we've screwed up or not. Mm-hmm. Come on. Has anybody gotten anything to output to the console? It might be my API because... Oh. Okay, so the thing is, remember how we created the session and then we created we said the data task that the session runs is this. Another thing that we had to do to the session itself was we had to run it. So if you go down after the last brace that defines set data task, type in .resume with parentheses. And now if we run it, there you go. You'll notice that when we print it out, if you notice, there's all this different code, and it has all the information that we're looking for. Height, attack, name, ID, evolutions, description, weight, special defense, stuff like that. Oh. I'll go ahead and post the code into the Google Docs. Anybody having any issues or all good? Also, if anybody wants to leave, feel free to do so. It is pretty late. Don't worry, you guys are all good. You're not assholes. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. What's up? So Resume actually runs the data task. So what we've just done is we created the session, we set the data task, and the session actually runs this stuff. But we didn't actually run it. So
Also, this will make it actually.
yeah, this will make it actually. Yeah. Good night, man.
So is this calling API function is running asynchronously?
Yeah, it is.
Oh, alright. So
Session data task takes care of that for you. What you can do is, yeah, so you don't have to worry about it. It'll just do it for you.
alright. So can you teach me how to create a simple API? Because I'm working on it right now in my C# class and I'm running into a lot of problems.
Oh, I'm not sure how to do it in C#. I wrote mine and put this one in Python.
Oh, can you show me how to do it in Python?
I can send you the repository. It's very strong. It's very easy.
Okay. Yeah, I just don't know how to get the web address.
Oh, so this web address is, I'm hosting it on a server called, so there's a service called Heroku, right? Heroku, Heroku, that lets you host like a server after you've built it. So the Python thing that I wrote was it's pretty much a server in a sense.
Alright, so it's like some outside server.
Yeah.
So it's an actual physical server, right?
Yeah. Well, so the idea is I created the API, right?
Yeah.
But the API needs something to run from,
Yeah.
right? So they let you host it.
Alright, so is that like a free web service?
Yeah, it's a free service. It just has some limits, like you can't be on like 24/7. Yeah. But yeah, I believe the data task is running asynchronously. I forgot. I haven't done this for so long. I'm not sure, but you could make it run asynchronously if it's not. It's very easy in as far as iOS goes. We will be doing some asynchronous stuff in a little bit at the end.
Oh, okay.
You're welcome.
What's the name again?
Siraj.
Heroku?
What? Oh, Heroku. Yeah. Heroku.
Heroku.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. All right. So now that we've finally gotten the information, we can finally put this into our UI. So let's start off with the easiest one. We're going to access the name label. So we're going to try to just type in name label. We're going to type in text, and then we're going to go to PokeInfo, and then we're going to access the name and then we're going to cast it as a string. So you might notice there's actually going to be an error that pops up. So there's something, I was talking to you guys about this previously. This is a closure. So the reason that we had to type in self, this code technically exists outside of the scope of the regular code. Those words might be a bit confusing, but just remember, if it's within another set of brackets within a function, you probably need to use self. So from this point on, for most of the stuff that we'll be doing to access the UI, we're going to be using self. Don't worry too much about what it does. Worry more about the right side of the code. But okay, so remember how I told you we're using a dictionary? So what I said is we had this dictionary, and inside it is all the JSON we just read. The JSON reads kind of like a dictionary. And we said the name object returns to us a string that holds the name of the Pokemon. So now if we actually run our app, if we wait a few seconds, we should get a beautiful error, and will not update at all. All right, so if you guys notice right now, there's a really big error that goes on, and it looks pretty scary. So we're actually going to get into something kind of complex here. So how many of you heard of what are called threads? How many of you know what multi-threading is? Okay, so there's a few of you. So when you're doing coding, right, you have a single computer. It's running code. So think of it as a single person working through something. But when all of a sudden at the same time you say, hey, you should also do this at the same time, that single person won't be able to complete all of that, right? So what we can do is we need to have another person update the UI while the code is running in the background. So by doing that, they've actually reserved a thread called the main thread that you can run it on. So what we're going to do here is, before we do the self.namelabel.text, we're actually going to do what's called the dispatch queue. We're going to access the main queue, and then we're going to run it what's called asynchronously. So let's put that code in here. So the reason that we had to run UI updates on the main thread is the main thread is reserved for UI updates. So now if you run it, you'll notice that it's cut off, but it's updated to Charmander. The reason is how iOS applications work is you have the initial worker called the main worker. That person, or let's say we'll just address them as a person. The thread, we'll call it a thread. The thread is updating the UI elements. By using a single thread to update the UI elements while everything runs in the background, it allows your app to be really smooth. Because if all of a sudden it's updating the UI, and then you tell it, oh, go get this network request, your app will freeze up because it's doing the network request, and it can't update the UI. By doing this, we're able to actually update the UI at the same time, and thus we're left with a much more smoother experience. So let's go back to our code and finish updating all the rest of the labels. So let's do self.idLabel.text is equal to pokeinfo ID, and so on. So go ahead, and I think most of you will probably realize the pattern that's happening here. Equals pokeinfo attack. All right. So one thing I want to show you is when you do the self.attackLabel.text and you try casting it into a string, you'll notice that nothing actually appears. The reason being is if any of you guys noticed in the API, so the name is a string. You'll notice it's surrounded in quotations. It's like a sentence. But things like attack and defense are actually just stored as regular numbers. So if we cast it into the sentence type object called a string, it actually won't do anything because it won't notice that there's a string there. It's the wrong type. So what we need to do is we need to get it as it is and then insert it into an actual string. So the way to do that in Swift, when you insert a variable into a string, you do this. And then also we're going to put an exclamation point after this. The reason we're putting exclamation point after it is we're saying there is a value in the dictionary called name, and we want to access it. And then the parentheses and the backslash says we're putting it within the sentence type structure. And so we're going to go ahead and run this. Oh, and it disappeared again. Oh no, there. I put the wrong one. Okay. There we go. Never mind. So make sure you're doing this as an attack label. My bad. And you notice now it's updated the attack correctly. The attack of Charmander is 52, and it's put that in there. So go ahead and do the same thing for the next few labels. So we have, you can just copy and paste it. It'll be much faster. We have defense label, special attack label, and special defense label. So we have defense here. And then for special attack, in the JSON, it's stored as special underscore attack. And then same thing for defense, so special SP underscore defense. So if I go ahead and run it now, you'll notice that now it's updated all the values. We got the attack, the defense, the special attack, and special defense. The next two things that we want to do are the height and the weight. So let's just do the same thing for those. What's up? Oh, just highlight it? Command C? Command V, yeah. It's just basic copy paste. I'm not doing anything special, don't worry. It seems like I'm typing it really fast, but it's just copy paste. I'll copy and paste this into the Google Doc as well. There you go. Uh-oh, and I also typed that wrong. All right, so by now, there we go. We got height and weight not correctly set. Oh. All right, so now you notice we got attack, defense, special attack, special defense, height, and weight. So the last two things that are remaining are the description and the type as far as text goes, right? So this is pretty straightforward. Can anybody tell me what code I would have to type to do the description? Anybody? Go ahead. Description label, yeah. Oh, so that, okay. And yeah, exactly. So as you notice, it's pretty easy to access these elements within there, and then putting it into the text label is pretty trivial, right? So we'll just put description. All right. So let's go ahead and run that. Let's see if it worked. You'll notice that I forgot to put the... Oh, but you'll notice something kind of funny right here. In the description, it says optional. This is because I haven't forced it. It's not sure. So it just wraps whatever's in it with the word actually optional. But let's go ahead and run it again. And there you go. So we got the text and everything working. But as you notice, it's getting cut off. So what we can do is just go back to your storyboard and kind of resize it. So, uh-oh. Oh, come on. Okay, never mind. Let's just keep it like that. I'll do resizing later. All right, so let's expand the name a bit. And just like Word, you can just like center align text, so it makes it much easier. So now let's run it. It'll look a bit more decently clean. And there you go. So we have Charmander, we have his description. It's getting cut off, but for now it's good enough. We have the attack and all the properties of the Pokemon. The last thing we want to do is get the type. So the type, I made it a bit more tricky than the other ones. So the thing about the type right now is it's actually stored as an array. You'll notice that in this JSON, there's brackets and inside is the string of the type. Pokemon can have multiple types. So let's say I go to Pokemon number 1. You'll notice it has multiple types. So right now, we don't really care about the multiple types. We just want to go and get whatever the first type is. So in our code, we can access that by just doing self dot. Did I not connect the type label? It seems like I didn't connect the type label. All right, let's connect the type label. Okay. But anyways, back to this. Make sure you have the type label connected. We're going to set the text of this to the same thing as before. So PokeInfo types. But if you remember, since this is what's called an array, which is a list of things, we just want the first element. In arrays, to access the first element, all you had to do is get the 0th. We shouldn't have too much of an issue. Right. All right, we're gonna have to cast this before, so we're gonna call this let types equals PokeInfo types as what's called an NS array, and then okay, so the reason that I did this is, if you get an array in Swift, right, from the JSON, it doesn't know it's an array, so we're casting it to this array type. So it's become a list of things. It can have an arbitrary amount of types. So we've stored it into this variable called types, and then down here, when we set the text, we get the 0th one. In programming, a lot of things are 0th index for most programming languages. So instead of starting at 1, 2, 3, 4 like most things, in real life, we start at 0. So 0 will get us the first type. So let's go ahead and run it. And there you go. So now we have every single property loaded correctly. We've actually accessed the internet and leveraged an API to do this. The last thing you might notice that we're missing is the image. So the image is a bit different because what we had to do is we had to access the API. The API will give us a URL for the image, so the location of the image. And then we make another request to the actual image itself to download it, and then we'll put it into there. So let's go back to our storyboard. And what we're going to do is we're going to add something called a UI image view. So let's drag that right here. I'm going to resize it if it works. There we go. And I'm just going to keep it at scale to fit. All right, so now let's connect this image view to our code just like we did with all those other views. Just going to connect it down here. We're going to call this sprite view. All right, so now let's go back to our code. Now that we have a reference to that image view, we don't need to go back to it. So first, let's start off by saving the actual URL of this of the image. So outside of this block, because remember we used this block to update the UI elements. Now we're not updating the UI elements anymore. So right here, after this bracket, we're gonna say let sprite URL equals URL. And then we're going to access the URL within the PokeInfo, just like everything else. And I stored it under what's called sprite. So we're going to cast it to a string because we know for sure that it's just going to be text. Because if you notice in the API, it's stored like this, right? So we're going to cast it to the string, and then we're going to put it into the URL object. We previously used this URL object to actually access the API. So by forcing it this way, we don't have to check because we've assumed the API has given us a correct one, as opposed to here where we safely checked if the URL was correct. And now the next thing that we had to do is simply load the image into the image view. So what we're going to do is we're going to call that dispatch queue again, but this time instead of going to this main thread, we can call the background thread. There's a background thread called global. So we can call global. We're going to run this asynchronous task. Don't worry about what that word means for now, but the idea is we're running it in the background separate from the thread that was updating UI elements. And then we're going to actually access the internet to download the data of the sprite. So we're going to say sprite data equals try, because this can error out, right? Because if the server doesn't respond with the image or stuff like that. But just for time's sakes and demonstration purposes, we're going to force it to work by putting this exclamation point. We're going to use what's called NSData. NSData will hold data that can be retrieved from things like the internet. So the parameters that we're going to pass is contents, of, and then we're going to give it the sprite URL that we just created. And then we're going to give it options of nothing. All right. Now that we've gotten the data, so what happens is when you download it, when a program downloads an image from the internet, it doesn't know it's an image. It just comes in as a bunch of characters, like pretty much it's ones and zeros, right? All data is just ones and zeros. So it's download this image. It's just this generic data type. Now we're just going to put it into an actual image object. In Swift, these image objects are called UI images. So we're going to say let image equals UI image. We're going to construct it as if you'll notice there's a constructor that says data using data. And we're going to use the sprite data that we just got. And then we're going to cast this as data. Don't worry about this error for now. All right, so now that we've created an image, well, we've downloaded the image, we've stored it in an image object. The last thing we had to do is just place the image into the actual image view. So if you remember before, I said we had to go to the main thread to actually update the UI. So what we're going to do is dispatch queue main async. So it's kind of weird because we're doing it within another dispatch queue, but what this lets us do is flip-flop between different queues. So now this is our last line of code. All we had to do is do self dot sprite view dot image equals image. And let's go ahead and run our application. And you notice, ta-da! All right, so what we've been able to do is we've been able to leverage the API to actually download information about a certain Pokemon, and we've displayed the information. It's getting pretty late. It's already 8:40. So what's up? Yeah, for sure. All right, so right now we've been able to leverage the API and actually display information. So we've accessed the internet to actually do it, rather than just accessing a random text file or already local storage, which is very easy. Actually being able to leverage an API is very impressive as far as like companies go, or in hackathons, most prizes, like I said, are based on using APIs. But yeah, congratulations on everyone who stuck through and finished, even though it took forever. I'm sorry about that, everyone. But yeah, we won't go over the next and previous things since obviously that's gonna take a bit more time, and I don't want to keep you guys here any longer. But yeah, the video will be posted to YouTube, and I'll post it on the iOS Dev Club Facebook page, which you guys should join if you're interested in the club. But other than that, how many of you guys are going to Hello World, the hackathon itself? About half of you. Okay. Yeah, just a shout out. The iOS Dev Club will be hosting a prize. We'll announce what that prize is at Hello World, but it's gonna be pretty good. All right. Well.